This is Jewish Spotlight, a weekly television program presented by Chabad Lubavitch of Long Island, featuring various aspects of modern Jewish life and Jewish culture. Now, here is your host, Rabbi Tuvia Teldin.
Shalom. You know, in life, we all have to set priorities. We have to decide what things are important for us and what things really are not major priorities in our life. One thing, for those of us who are adults, who are married, that we set as a priority is our children. And in doing that, we're making a statement, and we're taking a certain responsibility for who we are and who they are. And it's a very important issue which needs to be discussed from a Jewish perspective to see how the Torah views this such an important role in our life. Because when we say that we want to be parents, we have to realize that is a major commitment of time, of effort, of money, of resources. It doesn't happen automatically. We go to college and university, we put in a tremendous amount of time to get degrees and to be able to become experts in particular fields. And hopefully we excel in what we learn. But perhaps the most important role of our life is a role as parent that we have no training for whatsoever. And very few of us spend any real time reading books, going to courses, or learning anything about what it means to be an effective parent than just remembering what my parents did for me. And I turned out okay, so that means that I know everything there is to be a parent as well. And as we all know, especially in our complicated world today, life is very different than it was when we all grew up. And as a result, spend the next half hour with us now. You're not going to get all the answers, or not nearly all of them. But we'll begin the voyage of just being able to open up some windows to see how many issues there are that need to be dealt with, and understanding what our responsibility as good parents, effective parents, responsible parents really is all about. And for this issue, as usual, when it comes to these types of very, very sensitive, important issues, I have no less than my wonderful wife, who lectures internationally on this very issue, who is an educator par excellence and a teacher's degree, and it's always a pleasure to have her together on the show. So, Chaya, it's a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you. One of my favorite topics.
All right. Now, let's get right into it, because, as I said, this is an issue that everybody needs to spend time. In fact, as we both know, the previous Rebbe said that a person should spend a half hour every day thinking about the education of their children. If they're really doing what is needed in order to be able to make sure that their child is going to grow to be the kind of person that they feel they have an obligation to them to become. Mm-hmm. Now, what do you think the main issues are, and what would your message be out there to parents who are interested in bettering their parenting skills?
One thing that I think is crucial is not just to educate the body, but we have to educate the soul as well.
What does that mean?
Well, we have to be aware that there is a soul within that little person. I know certainly with our children, at 3 seconds after they were delivered, we said Shema Yisrael. We said ancient Hebrew words that the soul should be welcomed into this world and say, you know what, maybe it's not such a foreign place after all. Maybe it's not so scary and frightening. I recognize those words. We have to remember, I believe, that the soul is not 3 seconds old or 3 days old or 3 months old, but it's an ancient soul that is now here in a body again, and we have to educate it in a very holistic sense, the total person together.
So we're not just educating a brain or raising a head. We're raising a whole person, which is a composite of soul and body. We're educating the toes of how to function, of the heart, of everything.
For sure.
And that's a very holistic approach, which involves even more effort than just looking at education as a matter of giving information, which is a whole topic of conversation amongst educators itself.
You know, sometimes people are so cautious about the toys that the children play with, the fabric that the children wear. They should have only organic baby food or natural, and they're nursing their children. It has to be only natural. But what about that soulful dimension that we have to bring along and educate and polish at the same time as we're dealing with the physical body?
Can you give some examples of how you cultivate that type of soul development?
Sure, I think one of the things that the Rebbe spoke about many years ago was so important in terms of the sights and sounds that a child is surrounded by, to make sure that it's a kosher nursery, for example, that the animals that a child sees, even from the time that their eyesight is developing, that it should be really kosher things. The mobile that we had over the children's bed had a little tiny mezuzah scroll, and it was a little alphabet reading chart. The music that a child hears, people want classical music. What about classical soul music? So to really be cautious and careful and aware of developing their spiritual side as well, their Jewish side.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you mentioned about classical music. Somebody just mentioned to me also, somebody came to them and said that they were very disappointed that children didn't grow up with their true Jewish feeling. So I said to them, let me ask you a question. What do you do in the home to give them that true Jewish feeling?
Right.
And they told them the things they had done, which are what many people do, is once they're 8 years old, they send them to Hebrew school, and then they had their bar mitzvah, and that was their Jewish education. And once in a while, they'll observe some of the holidays, which is very status quo. And I said, let me ask you a question. If you wanted your child to grow up to be a lover of classical music, what would you do for them? Oh, I would give them I would
probably in
train
utero
them,
they would have
I
played
would
music.
train them in a particular instrument. I would take them to concerts on a regular basis. I would make sure that there's classical music playing in the house. I would teach them about the great composers and tell them all about the wonderful intricacies of how beautiful it is. And then, hopefully, my child would grow to love classical music. And they said, well, the same thing applies to Judaism. And really, the same thing applies to morality and ethics. It's an effort. You're taking a raw human being, a very raw person, and trying to cultivate them into becoming a refined person who has a love for ethics, for God, for Judaism, for mitzvahs, for Torah. This is hard work.
But very, very often parents wait, or they delay for some reason until they think it's age appropriate. But that is very, very dangerous. I'll give you 2 examples, I think. When should you teach a child modesty, for example? If you're going to say, I want to speak to a 16-year-old today about modesty, hello, it's really too late. So maybe at 11. I would say 11, it's too late with all the pressures that society. 7, why not from the cradle? In other words, we're not making speeches, but first of all, we're setting example. And we're teaching certain character traits, certain moral standards really from the cradle. One of the previous Rebbes in a discourse asks at what age should, let me see if I can remember it, cleanliness, modesty, and manners be taught. And the answer is from the age of 3. That a 3-year-old can already understand. They might not be modest or polite at all times, but that concept already from the age of 3 can be mentioned, discussed, and there's no shortage of ways today. There are books, there are videos, there are tapes, there are games. We want our children to be computer literate, but how about spiritually literate? Again, I say from the cradle, from before the cradle, you have to educate children.
Interesting. Now, let me ask you also, concerning education about God, to give your child a sense of who God is, what God is, how do you do that with a young child?
I think for us, God has to be a household word as well.
Now, the parents have to set the example.
Parents have to set the example. God should not, first of all, be somebody that lives or exists only in the synagogue, only when we're going to a religious ceremony. God should be part and parcel of an upbringing. Is not as big brother watching, not as a punishing, vengeful God, don't do that, God won't be happy with you, but as a very loving, connected, intimate member of the family.
I think many parents find also that when they incorporate God into the home and they say that we're doing certain things because we believe that this is what God wants from us, then when they ask their children to do the same thing, they can't be accused of being hypocritical, or they're not going to be looked at in a negative sense, because it's not like the parents are imposing their rules and regulations of morality and ethics on the children. The parents are doing something, they're just sharing with the children the exact same thing that they're doing. So that consistency is very important, because the children have X-ray vision today. They'll see right through it. If the parents are going to be keeping a double standard, the kids are going to know.
Definitely. But even from the cradle, I remember taking one of the children. I had a charity box in the crib, and every day you could put a penny in the child's hand and say, "This is a mitzvah. You are doing an act of kindness," so that by the time they're 3, they understand that money is something to do good for other people. This all can be. It's not programming. That's called education. We tell our children to look before they cross the street, or don't touch something that it's hot. or we try to teach them that it's important to share, we can teach them spiritual tools and give them spiritual guidance as well from a very early age.
I think many parents have a hard time with that because, first of all, you stand out when you do that. If you're going to be surrounding your child by these types of things, it's going to bring comments, and it's very difficult for people to go up against the stream and to be a little bit different and be nonconformist.
But look at all the studies that are done today about trying to teach children self-esteem and a sense of strong identity. When does that start? When is a child supposed to know who they are?
I agree with you. And I think that, to the contrary, the more that we surround a child from a very young age, and people can call it symbols, they can call it whatever they want to call it, but the child becomes accustomed to a certain mode of reality which they grow into, and we all know that the effect on the child from the very youngest age can have a tremendous effect as it goes on. Just like a small cut in a tree as it's young, when it turns into a larger tree, that cut turns into a much larger scar.
There'll be a scar in the bark.
Sure. You mentioned self-esteem also. Can you go a little bit into that as well? Because as we know, according to every psychologist, and for sure, the Torah has talked about it for thousands of years as being very important to have that type of self-esteem. In order to be able to care for others, you have to have a certain amount of respect for yourself.
One of the strongest images I have from when the children were growing up is, we have the custom for Shabbat, for the Sabbath, or for holidays to light candles at the commencement of the holiday. Our custom is to light an additional candle for each child. So right by that physical act of striking a candle, and you say, this is for this child, and this candle is for this child, the child sees not only do I count, do I take up space, but I bring light into this world. It has to be verbalized. You make the room brighter. But a child say, wow, isn't that amazing? A candle is lit for me, and I make the world brighter. That's a tremendous positive feeling for a child. In terms of Jewish identity, when the children look Jewish, and we know that it is not particularly easy. Some people might be very, very uncomfortable. But if a child knows, by virtue of the fact that perhaps they wear a yarmulke, a boy wears a kippah, a head covering from an early age, the child grows up, that's part of their identity. I am a Jewish boy. This is what I do. A girl has her own identity because this is who I am. It's taught and it's made with joy from the cradle.
And that identity, as hard as sometimes it might be to give into a child, nevertheless, it's something you can't pay $1 million for, because once a child has that sense of self and who they are, what they're here in this world to accomplish, there's nothing to compare with the direction and the goals that such a child can take. And in fact, is in gardening also. What do we do in gardening? You have a garden, you plant some seeds, and then you have certain flowers coming up, and you, by nature, weed out the negative, the weeds that are there. So in the personality of a child also, what is any different that there's something wrong with also weeding out the negative traits in the child? I think to a great degree, parents are very hesitant to weed that out.
Parents are afraid today. They've abdicated.
Exactly. They've abdicated a certain responsibility. They've given up. They have very great difficulties with discipline. And these are things that parents need to take hold of. And sometimes it can be very hard, and sometimes it can lead to a month, 2 months, 3 months of some real tension, depending on the age level and the maturity level of the child. But it's so necessary in order for the parents to take back parenthood.
I think one of the big 10, in terms of the 10 commandments, the commandments of honoring parents, I always like to say in parentheses, it doesn't say thou shalt love thy parents, it says thou shalt honor thy parents. Sometimes it's difficult to love your parents. If a teenager might not feel in a loving mood, but respect, honor, one can always do. Sometimes it means walking away, sometimes it means swallowing, or looking the other way, overlooking something. I don't always have to answer back, but I can always honor a parent. But vice versa, the parent needs to almost deserve that honor. They need to treat others in an honorable fashion in order for it to be reciprocal.
And be honoring their own parents, because they're setting an example thereby for their children how they're going to be treated by them.
Sure. It's not easy, but it will make for a stronger human being.
Let's talk about peer pressure, which of course is such a powerful force in child rearing today. How would you recommend to a parent who's having a lot of problems in competition between what they say when they're asking the child to honor their word, as opposed to the child feeling the pressure of their peers to go in a completely different direction?
It's very tough. If ideally a parent was awake from the beginning and was able to create in their home a haven and a sanctuary where there's mutual trust, where the child can confide in the parent, not be afraid of the parent, where even if they did something wrong, the child will be secure enough in their relationship to be able to come and say, Mom, Dad, this is what I did, I'm sorry, but what should I do now? In other words, they will seek the counsel of their parents. If we have a situation where the parents are first coming into their own and being aware that they do not have that relationship until now, I'm a firm believer, one tool is in a family meeting and sitting down and saying, listen, let's talk. Until now, this is the score. This is how we function. This is how we reacted. I am game to try something new now. And I know it sounds unusual, and maybe you're not going to trust me, but I don't, for example, I don't like this friend that you're running with, that you're hanging with. I don't think he's a positive influence. What do you think? Is he picking you up? Is he bringing you to a better place? Or is this friend pulling you down? It takes a lot of dialogue with the parent and the child. Hopefully, it's taken place over the course of the years. You know, one of the things I read recently was somebody said that when a parent says clear the dinner table, for a lot of kids it means picking up the styrofoam boxes in the back seat of the car. If you have a Shabbat, for example, in your family, where Friday nights the family gathers around. I know you have social obligations. I know you want to go out. I know, but this is a time that is sacred in our family. I want everybody to gather. A whole week, we're fragmented. Let's everybody join at the table. We'll break bread together. We'll drink together. This shows children also.
With the TV off, the radio off,
yes, you know when alcohol is appropriate, so to speak. Let's make a blessing Friday night on wine, and the children will see this is an acceptable setting in which we're going to drink, and we're going to talk a little bit about the week. It is such a building of bridges between the generations. It is mind-boggling. For parents, make their children's make their favorite food, make their best dessert. Do something to draw them to the table.
Now we're getting serious.
I know your best dessert. For everybody to sit at the table together, and then the family will go their own way. But at least this is time that we spend together no matter what.
I think that accomplishes something else as well. And that is that your effort is to establish an identity for who and what we are. Within the four walls of this house, what does our family represent? And those are, whether it be that is a corporate meeting of the board of directors on that Friday night, as far as getting used to what we represent, talking about certain values, talking about certain issues that wouldn't normally be covered during the rest of the week. To have that time to be able to bring everybody together. And what it does also, it's able to allow for a certain litmus test if other things that are brought into the home are going to match the goals and the identity of this family. Because once those kids go outside of those four walls, you have very little control about what kind of exposure they're going to have, what kind of peer pressures they're going to face, what kind of kids they're going to meet.
But how about developing their own personal relationship with God? How would you do that? Because then I believe that when a child faces disappointment or frustration or anger or sadness, and they're going to want to have it out with their Creator, if they have such a timid, shaky relationship, they're going to have to squash that and suppress it.
Right.
And when they are adults, they're going to have a whole attitude with God. They're going to have a lot of baggage. So I think it's imperative, not only do children have their own relationship, but they feel that they can communicate with God.
But it goes really back to a Friday night meal, that it's an opportunity to discuss about certain things. If there's anger, how do we incorporate that anger with a belief in God? How do we draw upon some spiritual fountains or wisdom?
Disappointment, frustration.
Exactly. I mean, all these things can be talked about in a very real, practical, down-to-earth way, so the child will see from a very young age that they can be open about discussing these issues, and that there are ways of looking at it that perhaps are different than what their friends might be telling them or what the 17 magazine might be telling them. So these are obligations that fall upon the parents, and I think that for many parents it's a very overwhelming thing to think that they have it within their hands to have such an influence on their children, and they withdraw from it.
I think for many parents, they themselves don't have a comfortable relationship with God, so they are hesitant about imparting that to their children. They're afraid. They don't have all the answers. I think it's okay to tell children, you know what, I don't have all the answers either. This is my struggle. Or even confessing, so to speak. If you made a mistake, what child wouldn't be able to respect their parent when the parent says, you know what, I made a mistake, or I'm sorry, or I don't understand what God did in this situation. I'm praying, maybe I will understand it tomorrow.
Let's talk about discipline also, because I think it's combined with a lot of the issues we've touched upon, but it's an area for itself which every parent struggles with. And many parents decide that they're going to draw the line at a comfort level that's comfortable for themselves, but not necessarily what's best for the child. How do you draw the line?
First of all, there's certain black and white areas. Certain things are acceptable, permissible. What I would say, certain things are kosher, and certain things are not acceptable. So discipline needs to be meted out when somebody crossed the line, and they need to know that that was inappropriate. Now, sometimes just verbalizing that is sufficient. Sometimes taking away privileges, not rights, but taking away privileges is another method. But I think a parent has to be consistent and has to be firm.
Very
You
important.
can
They have to stick to
verbalize
their
it,
guns.
and you could say why you felt it was right or wrong or inappropriate. I respect you as a person. I don't like what you did. Of course, there's no name calling. Nowhere in the Torah does God call people names. You know, we're not. But you say this behavior was inappropriate, and there's a consequence, and it's okay. But I think a parent has to be consistent. I think they have to stick with what they put out there.
How about in situations where a parent feels that they want to be their child's friend, or in a divorced home where the parent wants, right, there's a struggle to try to befriend the child and make the child favor one over the other. You know, we're getting into some very complicated dynamics there, and the question is, how do you balance being a friend and being a parent, even when there are certain reasons that you would want more to be a friend than to be a parent?
I think a parent always has to choose the high road. First of all, we never degrade or belittle somebody else. We never trash anybody else. You have to choose the high road, and a child will ultimately respect the parent for choosing that high moral road. I think that's imperative.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of examples would you give for that? Can you think of anything offhand that a parent must sometimes do something or say something that a child's just not going to like, but it's got to, the parent has to represent something? Because in the eyes of the child, if the parent's not going to stand for something, then what kind of parent is this? And the parents sometimes shy away from that role. They don't realize that the child very often wants the parent to represent something and to say something that might be controversial, and be what they are.
I think it's interesting. Until we no longer have parents, you could be 70 and your parents could be 93. You're still a child in their eyes. We are obligated still to honor our parents in that situation, and I think that will set a good example for our children. But I am of the philosophy that we don't have to be our children's friend. Our children have friends in school. They want us to be their parents. They want us to be their moral guidepost. And it's not always a popularity contest.
Right.
You're not always going to come out on the winning side, especially when you're the disciplinarian. But you have to say, I love you. I'm doing this not for your own sake, for your own good, but I'm doing this because I want you to know that this is the right way, and I hope that you will do the same in your household. Mm-hmm. I think if we can discipline with love, with a kiss, and not a patch, not a slap, we'll be so much more successful.
No, you bring up a very good point, that a child can have plenty of friends, but they can only have two parents. And giving up that position is a disservice in and of itself.
A major disservice to the child, absolutely.
Now, let's say in terms of internet, in terms of TV, as far as, and this gets into the discipline thing, but it's also a matter of education, because it's competition with other responsibilities they might have. It's sitting in front of the tube and just eating and fussing.
You have to trust your child, but you're not supposed to put obstacles. Don't pretend. Don't stick your head in the sand. I would never put a computer with internet, for example, in the bedroom when the child could sit by themselves for hours and hours. First of all, there's no social interaction with the rest of the family, and who knows where the child is wandering. You want that computer, I'll put it in the den, in the family room, so that you can walk past, see what's going on there, and be a responsible parent.
But this is all part also, I think, of realizing that the home is the place where you have to create an environment that represents something. It represents certain values, and we have to be consistent. What you're going to do outside the house, I might not have control over. But I want you to know that this is who you are and this is what we are. You might not like all parts of it, and I'm going to try to make it as palatable as possible. And your father and mother are trying as best as possible to be the best parents we can be and to love you as much as we can be. But we have to represent something because that's our purpose in life.
And
as
not
parents.
everything is acceptable. You know, even in computer jargon today, garbage in, garbage out. I don't want to take garbage in. I feel it's being selective. I don't believe in censorship, but I believe in being aware and astute and in filtering and in monitoring. I don't think a parent could wear blinders and say, not here and not my child and not my house. I love to make our home the center. Let all the kids in the neighborhood come to our house. And it should be I'll give out the cookies and milk. That way I can be aware of who my child's friends are, what's the buzz among the gang, what they're playing, what they're talking about. You have to be aware if there's any change in behaviors. I mean, all the standard signs of something going haywire. Again, it comes down to dialogue. Ask, talk, communicate.
And there's another point also, Chaya, that you brought up in the beginning, which I think is very important. We'll wrap up with this, and that is, in order to communicate values and ethics, mitzvahs, and the value of honoring your parents, these types of things, if it's based on a belief in God, you mentioned that a lot of times the parents themselves are uncomfortable with their beliefs. They don't really have a feeling that they're in a position to communicate that feeling to their own children. And I think it's an opportunity when people have children that they have to, out of obligation to the kids, more than obligation to themselves, to struggle with that concept, to struggle with their belief system and try to better articulate it so that they can represent something when it comes to that. Because a lot of parents, out of frustration, out of not being able to understand their own relationship with God, withdraw from it, and they're really copping out.
So I have a very practical suggestion. We say try it, you'll like it. How many moms and dads ferry their children to the soccer game and to the dance lessons, into this? Go to the synagogue. Go to services together. What beautiful image that will create in a child's memory when they walk hand in hand with their parent to the synagogue. They'll sit together, they'll sing. The father could say, you know what, I was uncomfortable in synagogue when I was a kid. I got through it. Let's look for ways of making it more enjoyable. Let's learn Hebrew together. Let's read the story of the portion of the week together. We share so many other things. We shop together.
Make a kiddush together.
Why do we relegate God to the back corner? You know, when we can fit God into the schedule of the week. God needs to be the moral cornerstone of the family, and the rest of the week could fit around that.
Well, thank you very much. As always, it's a pleasure.
Anytime.
And for our audience, I hope that my wife has given you some food for thought. She always gives me lots of food for thought, and thank God she's been a wonderful mother to all of our children. And I just hope that you'll be able to take some time and realize that this subject is so massive, and there's so much to it. And we spend a half-hour a day reading the newspaper, how many hours and years have we spent educating ourselves in other areas. This is an area that requires so much. It's perhaps the most important role we have in life, to have a family, to be before God as a good people, as wholesome people, as connected people. So go out there and do something. Make a resolution to be able to make your life better, more connected to God, more connected to your children. Shalom from the Jewish Spotlight. See you next week, same time, same station.